Wonderful. Thank you all for coming out to my session on accessibility tools and some best practices. A quick agenda for today. First, we're going to start off with a brief touch on the importance of digital accessibility. Then we're going to dive into some automated testing tools and some manual testing tools and techniques. And finally, to wrap up, we're going to go over some common and some more complex accessibility issues and ways that I've found to remediate them. And then at the end, we should have about 10 minutes or so for some Q&A. And I've got the link to the slides at the bottom here. If you would like to follow that, I can also paste them in the chat here for you if you would like to follow along. So first off, who am I? So my name is Fran Wiley. I am a technical lead at Northern Commerce, located out of London, Ontario, Canada, just south of Toronto, if you're more familiar with that. I've been in the Drupal space for about 4 years now. 3 of those years have been a major focus on accessibility. So I've spent a lot of time working with developers, project managers, QA testers on looking for accessibility issues, remediating accessibility issues, and just educating myself and those around me on the world of digital accessibility. So let's dive into why digital accessibility is so important. I like to start off all of my talks about accessibility with this because it's kind of the why do we even do this? And most importantly, most obviously, is for the humanity of it. At the end of the day, everyone should be able to use our sites, our products, no matter their abilities or how they are accessing our sites. But if we look at it on a more general scale, we can talk about the numbers. If we talk about it globally, that is nearly 1 in 5 people who identify with having some sort of disability. That's nearly 2 billion people. If you think about that from a sales perspective, that is nearly 2 billion customers you are missing out on by not making your site accessible. When we think about people with disabilities, our mind usually goes right to those who have permanent, lifelong disabilities. But it's also so important when we are talking about making our sites accessible, or making our sites accessible for those who might have temporary disabilities or just situational disabilities. I've got a graphic on the right side of the screen here depicting some brief examples of some temporary or situational disabilities to get your mind thinking of the different use cases of people who might be coming to our sites. Just looking at the hearing examples here, the permanent disability, of course, would be someone suffering with deafness. Something more temporary would be someone with an ear infection, or situational, someone like a bartender, or even simply someone who can't use audio on the device that they're accessing your site on. There's so many situations and so many people that are coming to our sites that we need to ensure they can use our sites. Simple as that. Finally, it's the law. I come to you with this slide as someone who is not a lawyer in any way, shape, or form. The world, globally, there's been a lot more laws put into place to ensure that the web is covered as far as making sure that people with disabilities have fair access to it. So in the States, you have the ADA and some more site-specific laws. The UK, they've got the Equality Act. Here in Ontario, where I am from, we have the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and globally, so many more. Again, I'm not a lawyer. Look into your local laws. Hopefully it's in there. And before I jump into the rest of this presentation, this is really what I want to touch on the most. I'm going to be sharing a lot of tools and techniques that I find helpful when testing accessibility, when ensuring that the products that we create are accessible. But really, at the end of the day, the only way that we can ensure that our product works for people with disabilities is by bringing in people with disabilities to test and to use our product and get their feedback and involve them in the process of building it. That is really, at the end of the day, the only way that we can ensure that these people can use our sites. So let's dive into some automated testing tools. So there are so many super helpful tools that we can use to do a click and test to make sure that our site is accessible. I've listed 3 here automatically that you've probably heard of. These are super common tools that even myself, I use on the daily basis to check and automatically scan a web page or component for accessibility. Those tools being Axe, Wave, and built into Chrome, we now have Lighthouse. These tools are super great because with a click of a button, we can scan our page to ensure that what is currently on the page is accessible as far as what the automated tool can scan. Since these tools are right in the browser, we can use them while we are actively developing. And then our QA testers can also do them with a click of a button. Makes life super easy when we're testing a small scope. But if we think about our product on a larger scope, we might need something a bit more comprehensive. These tools I've listed on this next slide are tools that we can use to scan our sites as a whole. Most popularly, you've probably heard of Site Improve. There's a few other here that I have had positive experiences with, like Axe Monitor, AQA UsableNet, Essential Accessibility, and DynoMapper. These are all tools that are paid services, I will note, that we can use to get a more broad look at the level of accessibility that our site currently has. These tools will scan every page of our site and run an automated scan on each page, just with one single click of a button. So different from the tools previously that were for a smaller scope for a single page, these tools will do the same thing, but on a larger scope. So on the note of automated tools, it is super important to remember that these automated scanning tools are just the first step in the process, because at the end of the day, they are just machines, and a lot of accessibility comes down to context and how we as humans interact and perceive things. So majority of the guidelines we need to follow, we will actually need to go in and manually review ourselves. So if these manual tools say that, hey, your site's accessible, it is almost certain that you can assume that that's not entirely true without manually confirming it yourself. I see Sean also just posted in the chat a link to the IBM tool. Awesome. Definitely something I haven't had the chance to interact with myself, but would love to look into it. There's so many tools out there, so if you guys have some cool ones that you like to use on the regular, feel free to drop them in the chat. These are always being developed, so there's always going to be new and cool ones out there that even me myself, I would love to certainly try out. So thank you for that, Sean. Yeah, let's dive into some manual testing tools and techniques. So when I go to manually test a site, this first list here is things that are running through my mind when I'm looking through a site for the first time. Of course, this is not a comprehensive list of everything to test to make your site accessible. This is just to get your mind thinking about things that you should be looking for if you're coming to a site as a tester, if you are building something as a developer. These are the things that should be running through your mind when you're creating a product and you want to test it for accessibility. So right off the bat, is everything functional with a keyboard? Or do I need to rely on a mouse to use things? Obviously, we want to make sure our product can be accessed in multiple ways. So we want to make sure everything is keyboard accessible. When we're navigating with our keyboard, is everything able to be focused? What about with a screen reader? Is everything read properly with a screen reader? Do we have the appropriate attributes to communicate what certain functions elements have to the screen reader? What about with Zoom? Can we zoom our site all the way up and is everything still functional? Can we still see all the text? Is everything actually zoomed? There's a lot of situations where you can go to a site and zoom all the way in, but it doesn't actually zoom any of the text and defeats the purpose of the zoom function itself. So we want to make sure that that tool is actually working expected. What about the skip to main link? Does it exist? Is it functional? Do all of our colors actually pass the contrast minimum? With the automated tools, they're great for just checking a one-to-one solid color, but they really cannot check for anything with like a semi-transparent background, or if something has a background image. All those we'll need to manually check. Are there any empty links with no content? Any like icon buttons, so like your hamburger menu button, things like that, I find tend to fail a lot where people will just throw in an icon, but none of the actual real hidden text. Are we using semantic HTML? Are we using headings, paragraph tags, things like that? And what about alt text on images? Is it there? Is it descriptive? If there's text within the image, is it included in the alt text? What if it's a decorative image? In that case, is the alt text empty? These are all things I'm thinking about as I'm looking through a site. And let's talk a little bit more specifically about keyboard testing. A super fun, I'll say, a great activity that I do a lot when I am building or testing a product is to simply just move my mouse out of reach and see if I can navigate the site using just my keyboard. So can I get through all the menu? Can I access all the menu items? Does everything function properly? So can I open, close accordions? Are there any modals? Anything like that? Is it all functional with just the keyboard? When I'm navigating through, is the focus outline always visible? Is it landing on any elements that are invisible, or is the focus outline just not there in the styling? What about the order that the focus moves in? We want to make sure that the order that you are tabbing through the site in is actually the visual reading order as well. We don't want it jumping all over the place because that can be super confusing. And then we want to make sure that there's no instances of keyboard traps. So this happens a lot with modals. If a modal opens and your focus is taken inside, you got to make sure that there's a way with just your keyboard that you can exit the modal and not get trapped within. Next up, let's talk about screen readers. We have most likely all heard of the two most popular screen readers being JAWS and NVDA. And then I've also linked on the slides here a super handy link for both of these screen readers for their keyboard shortcuts and some common ways to use them. Something super interesting with these screen readers through the past, NVDA, since it is a free tool and JAWS is a paid tool, NVDA has become more and more popular over the years, and JAWS, because of this, has become less and less popular. If you look at the graph on the bottom right here, back in 2020, for the first time, NVDA actually passed JAWS as the most popular screen reader, which was, super great. It's a free tool. It is more accessible because it is free. So it's become the most popular tool. That's great. Until last year, WebAIM survey here, JAWS is back being the #1 screen reader. I can't really tell you why that is, but I just like to use that as an example to say, this just iterates that you cannot just use one specific tool to test for accessibility. You need to make sure that you are diversifying how you're testing. So using different tools and in different browsers and different combinations of both to ensure that we are getting a full scope of our site and that we're testing it in a bunch of different scenarios. And to make that process easier, a tool that I use is called Assistive Labs. This is another paid tool that I've been using for the past year or so. It's an emulator for a bunch of different assistive technologies. So we have access to NVDA, JAWS, VoiceOver, and TalkBack, all right online on this one emulator. We can select different versions as well as different browsers to test in and different versions of those browsers as well. So it's like a one-stop shop for all of your testing needs. I also really like this tool as well because it does have the local option. So when I'm actively develop something, I can just throw this up and put in my local host and test it right there. And so it's a super cool tool. And next up are some contrast checker tools. There are so many of these out there, so many that work great. These are just my favorites that I use often. If you know one that works for you, wonderful. First up, we have the WebAIM contrast checker. This one is screenshotted in the top right. Super simple. You just toss in a foreground, toss in a background color, and it will clearly show you what the contrast ratio on those are. And then they also have a super handy tool to adjust the lightness. So let's say you throw in a color and it is just slightly off. You can just simply move the lightness controller over and make it a little darker or lighter. And then so it'll pass the ratio and you can use that new color. WebAIM also on this same site has a link checker so that you can compare your link color to the body color, to the background color, and make sure all your ratios are aligned there. Second item on the list here, the contrast-ratio.com. This one is great for testing colors with transparency. So if you want to test some text color over a semi-transparent background, that tool is great for that. And finally, the bottom two are two grid contrast checkers, like I've screenshotted in the bottom right of the slide here. These are great for using at the beginning of a project when you're presented with a style guide of many different colors and you want an overall view of which colors you can and cannot use together. This tool gives you a glimpse of them all together, and so you can see right off the bat and not spend all the time going one-to-one, and checking each individually. And finally, one more tool I use on the daily is this one called Headings Map. I've just linked here to the Chrome extension. This is just a one-stop shop, a one-click to see the heading structure of the page. It'll highlight any headings that are out of order. Just super handy tool I use all the time. And finally, some additional resources. I've linked here to the DQ and the WebAIM accessibility checklists, as well as a how to do an accessibility review checklist from web.dev. These checklists are great as a starting point to go through and to review your site. I find these are really great for people who are starting out with accessibility, may not have the confidence to know what to look at right away, since web accessibility is such a broad topic and there is so much to learn. These checklists are a good place to start and to build confidence to know where to look and issues to look for. So if you think you are at a spot where you're not quite sure where to start, I would definitely start here with these checklists and review. And just know in the back of your mind that this is not the be-all end-all for accessibility, but to keep going from here, this is just your jumping point. So now let's take some time and let's jump into some common accessibility issues and ways that I remediate them. So these are the more simple issues. First off, starting with heading order. So within some of the Drupal default core themes, the example here is specifically from Classy. The node template includes the rendering of the H2 if the node is not a page. In many situations that I've run into, this doesn't work when we are listing them in a block view, because the block itself, the title will be an H2, but if our view contains a bunch of nodes, and those all have H2 headings as well, you'll just have a whole bunch of H2s on the page, which semantically does not make sense. So in this scenario, to remediate this, simply all we need to do is duplicate that node template and make it specific to our content type and our view mode, and change that H2 to an H3. Next up is an issue with our custom functionality. So a lot of situations when we are building custom functionality, there's a tendency to only tie event listeners to the click event, but we also need to make sure that these are tied to the enter and or the spacebar event as well. That can simply be done by targeting the key press event listener and calling either the 13 key or the 32 for the enter or the spacebar, and just calling the same functionality. Next up is focus control. This one comes into play a lot. One example that I see it a lot on is Ajax views. So when we're creating views that are reloaded with Ajax, it actually rebuilds the entire view markup. And so if our focus is within that view, let's say on the exposed filters or the facets, because that view markup is rebuilt, the element that was in focus is gone. So sometimes the focus will be sent back up to the top of the page, which can be super frustrating because then the user, let's say using a screen reader or using their keyboard only, would have to navigate all the way back down through the content, back to the view, just to select another setting, just for it to happen again. You can see how this can be super frustrating. So we can throw in some custom functionality there just to simply log the element that was in focus, wait for the Ajax to complete, and then send the focus back to that element that the user had selected. And then similar situation when we're opening modals, we always want to make sure that when we open the modal, focus is sent, well, first of all, into the modal, and then into the first element. And then when we're closing the modal, make sure that the focus is sent back to the element that the user was on previously, which in this case would be the button used to open the modal in the first place. Next up is dynamic content. This one we can think about in the context of views as well. So if we have a search view that is reloaded dynamically with Ajax, visually when we update the page, we can see that the content has updated. But for those using screen reader, we won't be able to know that the content is updated without actually navigating to the content itself. So what I like to do is utilize the ARIA Live attribute. What this will do is when the element is updated, it will read the content of that element again. So in this case, if we're using a search view, let's say the user has entered a value into the search text field, and then they submit, the view reloads, and this will then read to the screen reader saying blank number of results found for whatever their search value was. That way the user won't have to go from the text box down to the content to see if any content loaded, and then let's say if it didn't, go back up. This will just improve the usability in that sense. Great. So now let's talk about a couple more complex issues with some more dynamic elements. Starting with accordions, specifically custom accordions in this case. We're going to want to make sure that we are using semantic markup and we have some ARIA attributes that we can use to improve accessibility. In this case, for semantic markup, we're going to want to make sure that our accordion trigger is using a button element. And as we know, we're going to want to make sure that this button element can be opened and closed using not only your mouse, but your keyboard as well on the enter and space bar. And then as far as attributes on that, we're going to want to make sure that the accordion trigger itself has a unique ID. Then we can use the ARIA expanded attribute, which will either have the value of true or false, which should dynamically change depending on if the accordion is open or closed. And then the ARIA controls attribute, which connects the accordion trigger to the actual content itself. And that references the unique ID of the accordion content. And then on the accordion content, of course, we've got that unique ID. And then we've got the ARIA labeled by, which references the button. And in some cases as well, it would make sense to wrap the accordion trigger in a heading, in whichever heading level makes sense within the context of the page. Next up, let's talk about tabs. So tabs themselves, again, we're going to want to do similar mindset as we did with accordions, making sure that our markup is always semantic and utilizing the attributes that we have to assure accessibility. So first of all, we're going to want to use the role of tab list. This notifies our assistive technologies that the element here is actually a list of tabs. And then for each individual tab trigger, again, these will be buttons. And we're going to have some different attributes on these tabs themselves. Similarly, we're going to have a unique ID on each tab trigger. We're going to give them the role of tab. And then the ARIA selected attribute. This is similar to our ARIA expanded, where it's going to toggle between true and false for the selected tab. And then the ARIA controls, same as the accordion, which references the related tab panel. And then for the tab panels themselves, so this is what contains the content, these will have a unique ID, and these will have a role of tab panel, and then they'll have the labeled by to reference the related tab trigger. So that's what the markup for tabs look like. There are a bunch of different tab functionalities out there. Many that work. This is one that I found just works best for me in my workflow. So this is definitely not the ultimate source of truth. This is just the way that I like to do it. So the way that I like to create tabs is making them activated on a event. So in this case, on a click, an enter, or a space. So when one of the tabs has focus, you can hit enter or hit space, or of course click on it, and that is the event that is actually going to open the related tab panel. There's other scenarios where tabs just open on the focus itself, but the scenario we're talking about specifically opening on an event. So then let's talk about with the functionality of hitting the actual tab key. So when we're navigating our site using only our keyboard, hitting the tab key, the whole tab list itself, so the wrapper around all of the tab triggers, that will just have one focusable element, just the focus will land on the active tab. And then if you hit tab again, it will navigate to the next focusable element, which likely will, in this case, will either be in the tab panel itself or following it. To navigate between the tabs, when the focus is on the active tab element, you can use the left and right arrow to navigate to the next or previous tab. And then finally, the home and the end buttons. This is just additional functionality that is definitely not required, but just a nice to have. Pressing the home key takes the user to the first tab, and then the end key take the user to the last tab. Great. So that wraps up our complex functionality there. Coming out of this talk, I hope you found some tools that you can use, maybe some new things that you can try, feeling inspired to, I don't know, think more about accessibility in your day-to-day life. Don't be afraid to ask questions, get other people's perspectives, most importantly, work with people, people with disabilities, people with different experiences than yourself. Doing any of this, incorporating accessibility into your everyday life, as small as it may seem, will make the web a better place for everyone. And that's that. Do we have any questions or anything I can follow up on from what we chatted about?
Thank you, Fran. Yeah, I'll keep an eye on chat as well. And I'll help answer any questions as well for you. Do you have a link to your slideshow by chance? Or I know this session will be recorded and it'll go up on YouTube, so I can get those.
I just put it in the chat there, and then put it on the next slide here. Yeah, just a bit.ly link there.
Yeah, I want to try out a lot of those tools. I wish that my coworker Michaela Blackham was here, because she's our accessibility auditor at my company, and she would love this presentation.
I love that. Yeah. I love talking to like-minded people.
I really enjoyed your presentation too, and I again look forward to testing out a lot of your tools that I've never heard of before. So that's awesome. Very perfect. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
How did you get into the accessibility realm? If I might ask.
If I'm being blatantly honest, it was kind of like a wake-up call. I came out of school and I took a development program at a local college, and there wasn't a lot of focus on accessibility. And then coming into the real world, it was just like this big sort of mountain, if you will, that I was just like, whoa, I don't know anything about. Like, this is a super cool challenge for me to just like dive into, and kind of just like took it and ran with it. So yeah.
Nice. You sure did.
Yeah.
Perfect.